Hey guys, exciting news here. I bought a new PC, this time with a fancy schmancy Ryzen 7 and a fancy schmancy RTX 2070, so I am able to run Shin Shin Taisen. Devil's Server Overclocked for Nintendo DS but on PC, but at a not lagging frame rate. As they always say in Shin Megami Tensei, the catchphrase of Shin Megami Tensei, let's a go. So a go I shall. Let's. That reminds me, one of my favorite fanservice moments in Final Fantasy VII Remake was during the escape from the Sector 5 church, together with Aerith. Obviously one of Cloud's most popular lines, arguably his most beloved even, is the "let's mosey" before waltzing on down to the final battle. And this is a line that everyone was hung up on prior to the release of the first part of 7R. I don't actually watch YouTube myself, merely dump my creative works on it. But for example, I imagine you could probably find hundreds of opinion pieces discussing the significance of this line and how Cloud being presented as a character able to say that line would define the direction of 7 Remake. Whether Cloud is the jovial OG or moody guy from the sequels. Which, incoming tangent alert, raises a point that I must inevitably branch off of to discuss Advent Children, the wider compilation of Final Fantasy VII, and the negativity surrounding it. Post anything about Advent Children on any forum in any capacity, and the first reply you will get will undoubtedly be about how Advent Children bastardized Cloud. Advent Children ruined Cloud. Advent Children was a Flandersation of Cloud's character. Square Enix had no clue what they were doing. So on, and so on. But I will defend Advent Children's characterization of Cloud to my dying breath. Or rather, I already have. I've made so many remarks about this in the past that it's reached the point I usually don't weigh in on it anymore, despite my passion for the subject, because trying to argue against the lol Advent Children emo Cloud circlejerk is facing an impossible uphill battle. But I dare say it. Cloud's character arc is perfectly consistent and understandable within the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. It's just that for whatever reason people simply stop trying to read into Cloud where Advent Children is concerned. It's so hilariously ironic and poignant to me that when people say they remember Cloud as being this radical takes no shit hero who always makes decisive actions and never doubts himself like he was in Disc 1, they're actually remembering Zack. Zack both in plot and in practice literally becomes the character that people end up mixing with Cloud. Through fire and pain, through vengeance and regret, through mourning and acceptance, Cloud Strife goes through a very believable emotional journey across his many depictions. He begins a country bumpkin failing to realize his dreams of joining Soldier in Crisis Core. Mistakenly accepts the wrong interpretation of his dying friend's legacy due to severe Mako poisoning scrambling his brain. Travels the world far and wide to strike down the object of his revenge in Final Fantasy VII. Subsequently loses his emotional foundation after he no longer has a goal to anchor himself to in on the way to a smile, until he finally recovers for the sake of his family and friends in Advent Children. Then when we see him in Dirge of Cerberus he's back to normal and following with the events of the preceding film. I think the problem is that because of the aforementioned and all-consuming stigma against Advent Children, people intentionally avert their eyes to it. There is a very large and prominent crowd that actively does not want to try and read beneath the surface of this Cloud, the same way they read beneath the surface of 7's Cloud. It's a very organic development. Throughout 7 you can see all of Cloud's weakness bubbling beneath the surface, but he uses Sephiroth as a vice to hold that at bay. This is not merely an interpretation, but written plainly in text. We see this very instance at the beginning of Disc 2, where Cloud acknowledges he should leave the journey, but will push on in order to still settle things with his enemy. And settle things he does. But what next? With Sephiroth out of the picture he has to try and figure out what to do with himself now. Cloud had spent the most significant part of his life up to this point, driven by his hatred of Sephiroth. So when he's suddenly deprived of this, how does he now define himself? While struggling to find his identity in a rapidly changing world post-Meteorfall, Cloud's rising insecurities make him emotionally vulnerable, as we see in On the Way to a Smile, and this is a very human development. I know that I can't help but waver during times of significant change, and I'm certain it's the same for all of you as well. Change is something nobody is ever ready for, hero or not. Especially when you can't see a clear pathway ahead. It's all too easy to lose yourself in the process, and it is from this sentiment which Cloud emerges in Advent Children, as he slips into depression. And for a development of such surprisingly mundane origins, it follows that what resolves it is ultimately just a simple smile. Somewhere along the way Cloud got so wrapped up in his guilt he forgot that Aerith was smiling on that altar, that Zack fought for the sake of friendship when he was staring down the Shinra army, both to protect those whom they held so dear. Beating himself down and losing the images of their loving faces beneath his suffocating sadness. All he really needed was to see them embrace him one last time, and Cloud, flooded with the warmth of times long past and years yet to come, gains the strength he needs to leap toward the future once more. It's a positive storyline leading into a happy ending. Heck, for as much fervent and unending hatred it attracts, depressed Cloud doesn't even last the entire film. By the halfway point he's back on the upturn after his conversation about forgiveness with Vincent, with the film giving us these 4 sequential shots paralleling Tifa and Denzel in imminent danger to Aerith and Zack's deaths. However, this time he is able to act and saves them in time, reinforcing that Cloud is beginning to move forward again. Advent Children's portrayal of Cloud frankly has all the same subtleties and nuances as Seven's Cloud in its execution. It's just that people get so hung up on the memory of Disc 1 Cloud that they turn a blind eye to actually trying to read into compilation Cloud the same way. And then you see in Dirge of Cerberus that he has come back to his more positive mind state as a result of his character arc's conclusion in Advent Children. Joking around with Vincent in dry rhetoric as they have a phone conversation mid-sword fight. Within the actual compilation his development is entirely coherent and incredibly human. I think because there's such a stigma against the compilation people try and segment Cloud into different characters as Crisis Core Cloud, 7 Cloud and AC Cloud. People establish this mental separation between the true original sacred Final Fantasy VII Cloud and the dreaded blasphemous compilation Cloud, segmenting them into 2 different characters, rather than actually trying to empathize with how he progressed to that point, dyeing the entire story thread in uniform disdain. And honestly, I get that. I really do. There are so many embarrassingly terrible things in there. Man, do I understand the frustration and the desire to demonize the compilation, because I am a fan of FF7 before most things in life. It's my favorite game of all time, my favorite piece of media even, to the crazy extent where it almost feels like Square made the game explicitly with my own tastes in mind. So while I ultimately consider the compilation a net positive for the added characterization it provided to Zack, Cloud, Sephiroth, Vincent and Tifa, I also fully recognize just how damaging and idiotic a lot of the creative decisions it made were. The depictions lost a lot of their moral ambiguity in favor of black and white characters. They leaned too far into the sci-fi aspect and compromised Genova's abstract mysticism with the whole Genova cell hullabaloo in Crisis Core. And they seemingly tried to rewrite Genesis and Project G as the entire focal point just because they happened to get a collaboration with GAIA. Most unforgivably, they shoehorned Genesis and Angeal into the Nibelheim incident, arguably the most defining moment of one of gaming's most historically significant antagonists, and made it so they were the ones whose words sent him over the edge, rather than him realizing his origins himself, which is in stark opposition to the prior statement that in the world of Final Fantasy VII, nothing is above Sephiroth. I fully sympathize when you look at One-Winged Hollander and degrading Angeal clone number 3 and say, Squeenix, you bastards, this is not my Final Fantasy VII. But as with all things, I think it deserves credit where credit is due. I consider it a net positive. For every Project G in Deep Ground, there is a positive of what I would consider greater strength. For every Flanderization where apparently Word of God says that the only reason Aerith even joined the quest was because she loved Cloud, which is garbage by the way, you also get great faithful developments like Aerith's fun flirty personality during her time with Zack. They fleshed out a lot of characters in a really meaningful way. In Crisis Core we get more fun moments with Yuffie in her early age, and a nice dynamic between her and Vincent as the oldest and youngest party members respectively. We steal a larger glimpse into the painful love as Vincent and Lucrezia fall to ruin. On the Way to a Smile finally shows us the reconciliation of Tifa's growing survivor's guilt towards the people who were killed as a direct response to her terrorist actions in Sector 7. We get Reeves' pure goofy joy that he can finally be friends with the party in person. We get quiet moments of camaraderie between Sid and Vincent. We get the life and times of Zack Fair, the mysterious minor character central to Final Fantasy VII's story, who ended up becoming one of the most beloved protagonists in gaming history as a direct result of Crisis Core. You better believe that when we see Zack, the unwaveringly energetic and possibly optimistic Zack Fair, break down in tears because his mentor selfishly forced his hand as a way to commit honorable suicide. I felt that. God, did I feel that. And don't even get me started on the end of the game. Moving on to the new characters then, the existence of Angeal and Genesis as Sephiroth's friends is so important because it humanizes him to an entirely new degree. The fact that Sephiroth was once a legendary hero renowned the world over is such a central part of his character. And those two serve as grounding examples of this claim. Rather than just being told he was a hero before he went mad and getting a single flashback, we're presented with a tangible instance of this. Crisis Core proves to us that Sephiroth was once someone who could let out a joyful laugh as he reminisced about the time he spent playing around with his friends, sneaking into the VR deck while the lesser troops were out and all trying to best each other in a flashy contest of strength. Moving away from the characters, we get the world of Gaia itself fleshed out as well. Crisis Core shows us Shinra from an insider perspective, and the existence of other soldier first class like Angeal and Genesis only enhanced the perspective that it was a proper company, not just the Zack and Sephiroth show. There are new locations like Benora and Modioheim, which further strengthen Gaia as a real world like our own Earth, with lots of small towns all over. The existing locations aren't ignored either, as it shows us cherished places from a new fresh camera perspective, such as the quite sizable town of Calm, the ancient capital in all its luminescent silence, the rolling plains of the western continent stretching as far as the eye can see, the city of Midgar trembling beneath the pressure of meteorfall. The list goes on. And Dirge of Cerberus you can explore the sheriff from Advent Children, and that is the coolest thing to me. The culmination of these net positives to me is Advent Children as a character piece for Cloud. I can understand that as a fan of the original game, it can be all too easy to just dismiss the entire compilation because of its many missteps. But in doing so, you miss out on the parts of it that were genuinely great additions to its original world. Net positives, as in the positives outweigh the negatives. I am not saying that Advent Children is without fault. I think one of the most glaring problems with it is that it's torn between wanting to be On the Way to a Smile, episode of Cloud, and Final Fantasy VII 2, The Return of Sephiroth, and it kind of suffers for both. It's the final piece of Cloud's character arc that resolves his lingering regrets, and in that way it's attempting to be an introspective character piece. But then you also have the remnants of Sephiroth running around for the sake of 7 fanservice battles. I think it'd be a much stronger piece if they were to rewrite it to be half the length and completely cut out the remnants, instead making the villain/conflict geostigma itself. If you want to make the case that Advent Children ruining Cloud refers to the depictions it negatively influenced beyond the compilation, then I think you may have a case. Frankly, I am not happy with the way he was characterized in Kingdom Hearts or the first 2 Dissidias either. But again, in the grand scheme of things, these 2 appearances are not significant enough to warrant the amount of hate they've generated. And if you're looking to Kingdom Hearts or Dissidia as your primary characterization of Cloud rather than his main franchise, then let's be honest, that's your own fault. Anyway, returning to 7 Remake. I'm somehow more in disbelief that this is a real thing that really exists after playing it than I was when it was still yet to release. I already know Final Fantasy VII. I already love Final Fantasy VII, evidently. So all I really needed to consider this a success was for it to be a Gaia HD simulator, where I can see some of my favorite locations and cinematic set pieces in glorious Squeenix HD. And my goodness, does it fulfill that in spades. It's just a constant stream of the grimy architecture of the slums, or seeing Midgar as an actual functioning city. But everything surrounding that was fantastic too. The gameplay was bombastic, fast-paced and engaging, and I was particularly surprised by just how inspired the boss battles were. Final Fantasy VII Remake is honestly everything I wanted from it in a lot of ways. My original thought when I first envisioned a remake so many eons ago was that I really wished I could get a Final Fantasy VII with the perspective, overworld battles and ease of character switching seen in Final Fantasy XII. Surprise, surprise, that's exactly what I got. It seems like for every 2 minutes spent following the plot, I spent 6 just wandering around and staring at things. So much time had been spent just blankly admiring the sight of the plate above Sector 7 while listening to the music. I've always said that since upscaled Crisis Core was already like a breathtaking semi-remake of 7, then the real one would probably blow my mind. And blow my mind is. But even with all that, I think the first moment that really caught me off guard was the alleyway scene after the first Sephiroth encounter. The music they used in that scene was a somber version of the Promised Land from the beginning of Advent Children. It's something that probably meant more to me than most others, but that part totally made me stop in my tracks. I pay a lot of attention to music and media, and FF7's various soundtracks have always carried a lot of emotional weight for me. I suppose it was never really in question since the very first teaser was set to Beyond the Wasteland from Advent Children's soundtrack, but it's still really cool to see them dipping into more than just the original game selection. The music itself was phenomenal. I was a little worried after playing the demo where all the renditions of Bombing Mission and Mako Reactor were orchestral only, but there ended up being a healthy helping of the synths that were so emblematic of 7's steampunk identity. The most faithful remake imaginable of tracks like Who Am I, Under the Rotting Pizza, Trail of Blood, and of course the obvious Genova Quickening. Incredible new battle themes like Hell House and the Airbuster, which totally eclipse what I thought was even possible from a rearrangement of established tracks. Or even them managing to sneak, You Can Hear the Cry of the Planet, into the soundscape through its leitmotif being used for the new track, 7 Seconds Till the End. The game's soundtrack refused to stop surprising me in new, exciting ways. However, even with all that, my word was I not prepared for the music in the final boss. In truth, I've long been hesitant on the original version of the theme. I do like it, and to a certain extent have come around to it, but at the same time I've always held reservations about the original One-Winged Angel. At this point in time, One-Winged Angel is the song you hear before you know anything else about FF7, but when you actually play the game you realize One-Winged Angel does not sound like FF7 at all. I understand and appreciate that this is the point, as the high fantasy aesthetic of the final battle is deliberately in opposition to the grungy steampunk that came in everything beforehand. But it sticks out like a sore thumb in the context of the original soundtrack. It doesn't quite fit the rest of the music, and I usually consider Birth of a God as more indicative of a Final Fantasy VII final boss. But at the end of the day it is still One-Winged Angel, and when divorced from the gameplay experience, it is a boss theme worthy of all its accolades. Yet listening to this utter madness makes me wonder if this is how it felt for those first encountering One-Winged Angel back in 1997. With each shifting measure bringing an increasing bewilderment. 7R's soundtrack was a musical marvel chock full of unbelievable rearrangements. And yet One-Winged Angel Rebirth fittingly manages to be its crowning jewel. It's ferocious, it's intimidating, and it's powerful beyond belief. I am in shock that 23 years after the debut of one of the most iconic tracks in all of gaming, someone was able to compose a version that, in my opinion, redefines it. 3 minutes 25 seconds might be the key moment of this track to me, or at least the one that embodies it the best. It enters into the flute section, which is usually a brief respite in all derivatives of the original composition. But here the momentary peace is quickly shattered with a sudden forceful repetition that betrays familiarity and creates a sense of urgency. If it hadn't somehow achieved it yet, that moment in particular is where the danger truly becomes real and tells the listener that there is no rescue from this overwhelming pressure, from this unrelenting insanity. And said insanity continues to compound upon itself throughout the progression of the piece. Once we saw Sephiroth being an in-game boss, it was obvious that One-Winged Angel would be used for his battle theme, and the player is therefore braced for it. But the new music in the first act of One-Winged Angel Rebirth scrambles that confidence, to the point that when the original composition starts playing around 4 minutes in, we are no longer going, okay, got it, there's Sephiroth. But, oh no, there's Sephiroth. What an incredibly genius piece of music. I did miss Steve Burton as Cloud, since that was one of my all-time favorite voice actor castings. He had such a unique voice that fit Cloud so perfectly. But on the other hand, he was, well, not exactly the best voice actor. He could do good performances, but most of them were pretty drab, and some were even in the ballpark of the worst I'd ever heard. The new guy is immediately more dynamic than him, so I can accept that. The loss of the old Sephiroth VA hits hard though. I guess his voice was too deep, so they wanted a less caricature-esque guy this time around, but man, Sephiroth just does not sound intimidating at all. Moving on to discuss the game itself more broadly then. Although it's probably a little controversial, I do like, or at the very least appreciate, the change in style. Not as something that replaces the original per se, but as a new imagining. It was always apparent to me from reading their PR for the game that they were approaching this remake not with the mentality of updating 1997's Final Fantasy VII to modern standards. Instead, what if we made FF7 in the late 2010s? So I have no reservations about the difference in direction or pacing. Indeed, I'm actually really enamored at the prospect of taking Midgar and turning it into an entire standalone game. Using the remake branding, since that's Seven's big buzzword that isn't technically incorrect, but being a dramatic reimagining based on the same script. A new Final Fantasy VII, not just a shinier coat of paint. Generally speaking, the changes can be attributed to a sense of excess, which is not actually a criticism or condemnation, mind you, simply a difference in approach. With the flashy combat and movie-level theatrics, this version ends up feeling like what 7 would be like if it was envisioned more in line with the wider compilation, instead of having the style shift haphazardly slapped on a decade later. Losing some subtlety along the way as it becomes a bit less politically ambiguous, but supplementing it with a hammier and more action-packed aesthetic, full of absurd technology and ridiculous anime-esque fights as Cloud Flash steps around and leaps incredible heights with ease. Whether it's the entirety of Advent Children, the Sephiroth Genesis Angel fight scene in Crisis Core, the assault on Midgar cutscene of Dirge of Cerberus, wider media appearances such as Dissidia, Kingdom Hearts, Mobius Final Fantasy, or heck, even the VR theme park ride they had a while ago. Everything outside the original 7 has always had that style of breakneck aerial combat going on. So it's really neat to see a reimagining of the original that puts it in line with those. I also enjoyed some of the compilation references, like them paralleling the Advent Children motorbike fight with Cloud leaping onto the other guy's bike and using Braver on it. Even if I ultimately think the remnants were an embarrassment, who should be scrubbed from 7 history. As a longtime fan, all the small references and nods made me so happy. In fact, one of the parts I enjoyed most in the game was appreciating how Reno and Ruder strayed out of Advent Children with their banter and fighting style. Damn near had PTSD from the mentions of degradation and Type S and G soldiers though. It even musically creates an intertextual link together with the compilation. There is obviously the big one of them using the Promised Land, Advent Children's opening song, for the scene after you first see a Sephiroth mirage in the alleyway, as the Promised Land cycle of souls. But perhaps more interestingly, the game's main vocal theme, Hollow, ends up being fairly similar to the melodies and instrumentation of both Night of Seclusion and Moonlight Wandering from the Crisis Core soundtrack. There were tons of changes to the narrative, big and small. Tifa isn't supposed to start having doubts until after the plate drop, for example. But in 7R they launch right into that character conflict from her very first appearance. Or how Wedge was originally supposed to die after falling from the pillar, and Jessie never had that whole arc about visiting her home and seeing her decrepit father. It's inevitable though when you think about their aim of taking Midgar and turning it into its own individual game. What was originally just the introductory segment, lasting only 3 to 6 hours generally, had to become a standalone game with its own dramatic set pieces and high-strung climax. Which means that with the new pacing, some things from the original obviously don't work anymore. The biggest one, for example, is that in the original Sephiroth is treated much more mysteriously. The first time he's even really given a presence is when you climb the Shinra Tower, follow the trail of blood, and find President Shinra impaled with Masamune. And it's not until way later that you properly see him for the first time. But that obviously doesn't work when Midgar is its own game, since the new audience will be clamoring for 7's famous villain. But of course, in addressing the story, the juiciest part to discuss is its third impact-esque ending. Nomura at last lets loose the overly complicated fanfiction floodgates he had been holding back the entire time, and it pours out in a strange, seemingly time loop instigating finale. I definitely felt put off at first seeing all this Kingdom Hearts-esque nonsense in the finale, and was honestly insulted seeing Zack apparently surviving as a result of their actions, alongside the 7 seconds till the end line, plus the City of the Ancients theme, seemingly referencing Cloud having a chance to stop Aerith's death this time, which both betray the very meaning of what FF7 and Cloud strive are. But the Zack scene was apparently echoes of a what-if future that Aerith glimpses. I've heard you can tell because the stamp design is different, which is odd, but ultimately something I can ignore and move on. I at least appreciated it leading to Aerith's closing line, "I miss it, the steel sky," which somewhat parallels Zack's dying words, "Those wings, I want them too," which is nice. The suggestions about Aerith rub me the wrong way though, but we'll just have to wait and see how that pans out. The way I see it, there are 3 main possibilities for the ending. The first is that it's a rebuild of Eva-style time loop, and Sephiroth is aware of the events from the original game, intending to steer it in a different direction this time. This explains the game's subtitles simply being Final Fantasy VII Remake, rather than Remake Part 1, as the next game would no longer be under the remake umbrella. However, I do think that if this possibility is correct, then the finale was a frustratingly massive missed opportunity. For 90% of its run, this game was stylistically positioned to be something that takes place of the original Final Fantasy VII within the compilation extended universe, thus severing the original's controversial ties to its addendums and creating something that provides the best of both worlds. The original returns to the place it once occupied, and all the extra from the sequels instead feeds into this new work. That was such a genius, and such an obvious, might I add, route to take. However, the reason that so many people are suggesting a time loop and that it is going down a new direction relates to the sequences of the party seeing flashback or flash-forward scenes using video footage explicitly taken from the compilation. We see the meteor fall from the start of Advent Children Complete's opening or Zack's last stand from Crisis Core. And while it is tempting to fall into the trap of believing that this means they are directly addressing the compilation and erasing it as a predetermined future, I think one needs take a closer look before settling on that stance. It does indeed use compilation footage. However, the only scenes selected are those from when the compilation remade events from the original game. Conversely, we do not see any of the more defining characters. We do not see Genesis or Angeal. We do not see Kadage or Deepground. We do not see Cisne, Weiss, Elf, Shulk or anyone else indicative of that extended saga. With that in mind, I would sooner say that this sequence is to be interpreted as a simple vision of the future to come, rather than directly engaging with the compilation timeline. For such a quick flash of footage, it's equally as possible that Square Enix may have simply decided to reach for high-budget CGI footage that they already had lying around. Continuing on from this, then the second possibility is that there is no time loop, and this is just a surface-level plot element of Sephiroth and Aerith being aware of destiny through the whispers. The D is simply looming over the narrative as a godlike being that says, "Cloud, I already know everything that is going to happen, and it is already moving according to my will." In this case, the key line he delivers, "But I will not end, nor will I have you end," loses any time loop association, and just refers to his overhanging plan. As per the second possibility, the line can also be interpreted as the writers addressing the player themselves and their relation to the Final Fantasy VII IP, as Square Enix had previously used Sephiroth as a similar mouthpiece in the finale of Advent Children when he says, "I will never be a memory." In this case, the meaning would be interpreted as them saying that at last the promise has been made, and we are not even close to done yet. At current, I believe that this is the most likely candidate out of all 3 interpretations. But before I finish, in discussing the ending, there is one final possibility I must mention. Although I'm not entirely saying I agree with the theory I suggest here, I am at least interested in documenting it properly for posterity. The ending of the Final Fantasy VII Remake was confusing, to say the least. A lot of people are rightfully making parallels to Kingdom Hearts due to Nomura's involvement. But I believe we have no need to go outside the franchise to explain this. Cue the final battle, and we get a reference-filled confrontation with Sephiroth. It deliberately parallels Advent Children's last bout, with its ruined Midgar setting, heavily overcast lighting, and a plethora of shot callbacks intact. However, the bit of fanservice that caught my eye the strongest was in fact the boss himself. As I was playing, I kept noticing something. Moves that seemed awfully familiar. And as he countered once more, I confirmed that I was indeed seeing him use Scintilla. But it didn't end there. Heartless Angel, Octaslash, the Zanku blade beams, even an unnamed version of Oblivion was still in use. Indeed, Sephiroth was using his Dissidia moveset. The conflict ends, and so Cloud chases Sephiroth to the edge of creation, in a scene that immediately struck me as familiar. A floating fragmented battlefield hanging at the border of the universe. Imagery quite similar to what we frequently see in the Dissidia franchise. Haha, this is like Dissidia, I remarked. Then, almost as if to cement the relation, the camera switches over to focus on two opposing forces in the distance. A nebula of both blue and red. Something which, under the lens of Dissidia, harkens to its central gods of creation and destruction, cosmos and chaos. That's a rather auspicious parallel, I commented as the gears began turning in my mind. Throughout the entire game I'd been getting the feeling that this was a very different Sephiroth to the original we knew. True enough, this Sephiroth's sympathetic and seemingly seductive characterization is consistent with his Dissidian incarnation more than anything. Then when he seemed to be aware of the events of the original narrative, it made me think, hang on, Cycles, okay, wait, is this secretly Dissidia after all? It was to the point that for a second there I thought they were going to reveal they're using the Dissidia multiverse backdrop and cyclical nature as a means to explain the ways in which the narrative so dramatically turned away from the original. Though I ultimately do not subscribe to this last theory just yet, it was still a very interesting thing to see manifest, and one I believe is at least worth mentioning some actualized form. The ending completely hinges on how it influences the next game, in my opinion. It was alienating, but surprisingly I wasn't entirely against it. I guess for me I've always felt like the original exists in a vacuum, even if I am someone who usually defends its controversial extended universe. So to me the merit of 7R was never solely on its ability to be 7, which is perhaps why I don't feel nearly as slighted by its ending as a lot of others do. If I had to summarize, it all comes back to this idea of trying and failing to be the original work. The compilation, though it had much good, often stumbled into the pitfall of trying to launch off the original without keeping in mind its thematic core. While in comparison the remake, despite being nearly as dramatic of a reinterpretation, feels as though it comes from a place of respect and understanding for the story it adapts. And that goes a long way. Haha. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for Shin Megami Tensei Devil Survivor overclocking with me. This was a game. How do I end this video? As they say in Shin Megami Tensei, let's not go anymore, it is time to stop.